everybody, I'm Mrs. Ulrich and I'm one of the counselors here at McCutcheon High School, and I am here with Mrs. Deshesky from Harrison High School. We are doing this together to talk about child abuse. It's a very difficult topic to talk about sometimes, but definitely important to cover. So with us today, we have Rachel Panaisi from the Domestic Violence Intervention and Prevention Program, and she's going to go over the different types of abuse to help us be aware of what child abuse is and what we need to do if you think you or somebody else is a victim of child abuse. So at this time, I am going to ask Rachel if you can go over some of the different types of abuse so that students are aware of what they are. We want to make sure that we remember that this could be at the hands of anybody regardless of age.
Okay, so instead of using the word child abuse, I really like to use adolescent abuse, just to let everybody know that it can happen to anybody, any age group, any race, gender, socioeconomic background. A lot of people think when we talk about abuse, it's just physical, so the bruises, the bite marks, things like that. But a lot of times we think that the physical is something that can heal, but the most damaging is the emotional, because that takes longer to heal. So there's different components when it comes with abuse. So we have physical, emotional, sexual, dating, and also neglect is a form of abuse too.
Let's start by talking a little bit about physical abuse. What might that look like in you or in someone else?
Okay, so that's probably the most obvious and what people think about the most is the physical. So when you see, maybe you have bruises, unexplained bruises on you. You have welts, cuts, bite marks, anything that leaves a mark on you, or maybe you see someone else that has those marks on them. And maybe when you ask your friend, hey, how'd you get those? They give you this crazy story that seems a little bit far-fetched, and it's not so believable. That can start to raise some red flags there. Also, we have a lot with injuries that are at different healing stages, or injuries that haven't sought out medical attention. Okay, so maybe you have an injury, but you haven't been taken to the doctor. That's a form of physical abuse as well. Also, maybe you or someone you know has pain inside of you that can be internal damage, things that you can't see. Also, fear of the parent or guardian. So maybe you have a friend or somebody asks you about your bruise that you have and you're terrified to tell them how you got it, and because you're afraid of your parent or the person that takes care of you or the person that you live with. Also, maybe you see in yourself some aggressive, destructive behavior starting to come about, like your response to different confrontations or stimulations, you're responding more aggressively, or your friend is responding more aggressively. So you see these big changes in behavior, especially with physical abuse, but you also have the other end of the spectrum where you have maybe you're more withdrawn, maybe you decide that you don't want to participate in sports or after school activities, you're more disconnected from your friends, or you have a friend that's kind of isolated themselves. That can start to raise some red flags with the physical abuse as well.
Thanks, Rachel. The next thing that we want to touch on is emotional abuse, which can be really tricky because it's not something that we can see. It's definitely very hard to prove, and legally it's very difficult to prove. However, if somebody is suffering any kind of emotional abuse, we would want that person to reach out to somebody who can help, because support is needed for that person. So can you talk to us a little bit about emotional abuse and what that is?
Yeah, so I think this type of abuse is the one that's most commonly overlooked, just like you said, because you can't see it, but it does leave the most, I would say it's the most damaging. Let's say you have, abuse can happen from anybody. So it's not just a parent, it can be an uncle, a guardian, a sibling, it can be a friend as well. Let's say you have someone that's constantly yelling at you, calling you names, tearing down your self-esteem, your self-worth, you're not good enough, you're not talented, things like that. They also isolate you, okay? So they isolate you from your friends and your family. They put you down, your feelings are invalid, so maybe you come to this person and you say, hey, when you say those things to me, it really bothers me, but then they turn around and say, well, your feelings don't matter, okay? They're also using intimidation and fear, make you afraid of them. So maybe you have a friend or yourself, you're just afraid to talk about your guardian or your parent or your sibling or your uncle, and anybody, you're just terrified of that person because you know what they can do and that they threaten you and just tearing down someone's self-esteem is probably one of the worst types of abuse.
Okay, so a little bit on a flip side of that, tell us more about neglect, because we want to ensure that all students are safe and that all basic needs are being met.
Okay, so when we talk about neglect, a lot of times we think, let's say you see someone in the hallway or you see maybe yourself and you realize, hey, I don't have heat, I don't have water, I'm really hungry, I don't have food. Those are signs of neglect when your basic needs are not being met. Maybe a lot of times we walk in these hallways and we see someone that has ripped up shoes or clothes that are out of the season. So maybe it's summer and they're wearing sweatpants and a hoodie because that's all they have. Those can start to raise some red flags as well, because not having those basic needs met, and also the lack of cleanliness. So maybe someone appears to be, I'm going to put these in quotation marks, dirtier, or maybe they have kind of an odor. That can be a form of not having water to take a shower. So keeping that open-mindedness when we encounter other students, or if you notice that yourself, you're not receiving medical treatment, or your clothes are really dirty and torn, or maybe neglect, you're left alone. So you come home from school and you have nobody there. Also, another form of neglect would be confinement. So maybe you're not allowed to leave your room. Okay, so that's a big form of neglect as well. Also, malnourishment. So maybe you notice that in yourself, but it's kind of obvious when you notice it in other individuals as well. Truancy from school is another form of neglect, because they don't have that support system to encourage them to go to school or to keep them accountable for attending school. The biggest things though with neglect is having that food, water, and heat, the basic needs. And if those aren't being met within yourself or another individual, that's when you definitely need to reach out for help.
So at this point, we're going to hit on a really serious topic. I think we're all aware of it, but it's really important to go over and cover and make sure that we have all the information. So most people think that sexual abuse fits into just a very small category, but it's actually a very broad definition, and many things can be missed. So with that, could you go through how sexual abuse can be defined and what the different dimensions of that are?
Yeah, so a lot of people think that sexual abuse is trapped in this small box of just unwanted sexual contact. But there's so many more, like you said, dimensions that go into types of sexual abuse. So you have, let's say you have a friend or a relative or just someone you know force you to look at images that maybe are not appropriate, that are nude pictures and things like that. That is a form of sexual abuse, and I think that's very much missed when we talk about sexual abuse. There's also people refusing to respect your privacy when you're changing, things like that. Sexual harassment. So I know a lot of times people think catcalling is something to be proud of, but that's actually a form of sexual harassment. Also pressuring for nude photos. Even if you're in a relationship, you're not obligated to send those photos. And if you do receive those photos and you pass them along to other students, you are in for a lawsuit. That can be a criminal behavior. It's just a very touchy subject and a very, I wouldn't even know how to explain it, but it's just something that you just don't want to get involved with. So even sending a nude photo is part of sexual abuse if someone's forcing you to do that.
So along those same lines, and something which may be more common, we're hearing more about in the news, but maybe it doesn't get shared by students as much, is dating abuse. And perhaps there is the thought that we can't be the victim, or we can't be hurt by someone else, or perhaps we don't want to believe that that is what is happening. But people who date each other can also mistreat each other. So tell us more about dating abuse.
So what I do mostly is I deal with domestic violence, and a lot of people think because we aren't married or we're not in an intimate relationship, violence can't happen to me. And let me just tell you, dating abuse is exactly the same as domestic violence. Okay, it has the same outcome. So dating abuse can be anything between physical, emotional, just like I told you about the other forms of abuse. I'll talk more about the physical, like pushing, biting, punching. That's not okay, even if you're dating someone. Emotional, name calling, constant criticism, harassment, putting you down constantly. There's also the big thing about control as well. That's a big factor with dating abuse. A lot of people don't realize that obsessively checking someone else's cell phone or social media or asking for passwords or GPS tracking a significant other, that's a form of psychological abuse, okay? Taking freedom away from someone else is pretty much the definition, is what we define as being an abuser or being abusive. It's literally about power and control. It's about controlling another individual. So if you're dating someone and you say, hey, you can't hang out with guys or girls, or you can't do this sport or this club, that's a form of psychological abuse. Also, we talk a little bit about financial as well with dating abuse, because let's say you have a good job and your significant other has a job, but you're forced to pay for everything, or they tell you how and when to spend your own money. That's another form of abuse that's people don't realize, because dating abuse is not just physical. There's a lot more, many more components that go into it.
Thanks, Rachel. And to wrap up at this point, we're going to have Rachel in just a minute go back over some of the different signs of possible abuse. At any point in this presentation, if you feel like any of this information applied to you, we know that it's a lot to digest. We're going to go over what to do with that information and who are the various people that you can tell. We're very fortunate to have experts in our community like Rachel who have access to resources and can help us out in those situations, and we have a lot of people around that we would need you to tell if something like this is going on. So at this time, Rachel, can you go ahead and give us an overview of some indicators of the various kinds of abuse, and then we'll go over those various resources in our community.
Yes, I can actually talk about like what you would notice in yourself and what you would notice, because a lot of times we notice things in other individuals and then we apply it back to ourselves, and that's how we kind of figure things out. So if you're in an abusive situation, you might realize or start to notice that you have more of an aggressive response to certain situations or arguments. You're a little bit more aggressive, destructive, lashing out in classrooms. Maybe you have a student in class who normally is a very good student, but they're lashing out, they're yelling at students or yelling at teachers, things like that. There's the obvious is the physical marks, okay? The bruises, the bites. Maybe this person is also wearing long sleeve shirts and sweatpants in summer, trying to hide those marks, or that might be a form of neglect as well. Also maybe a withdrawn, so maybe you start noticing you're not hanging out with your friends as much, or you're not participating in activities that you love to do. I want to make it very clear that one thing on this list doesn't automatically make it abuse. It just starts to raise some red flags and gets people talking. There's also sudden grade drop. Maybe your grades are slipping, or someone notices your grades are slipping, or you're missing a lot of school, things like that. A big thing to realize is when you start talking to people about this, maybe you talk to a friend or someone talks to you, if you're starting to feel fear about your parent or guardian or whoever you live with finding out, that could be an indicator as well.
It's a gut feeling almost.
It's a gut feeling almost. And a lot of times we think the best thing we can do as a community or as a school is to be a passive bystander. But the best thing you can do is, even if you feel like it's not your place, if you see something or you feel it in yourself, you need to speak out, because you'd rather over-report than under-report, because you speaking out could save somebody's life.
And just very quickly, Rachel, can you go over, I know some people are very concerned about whether it's with themselves or somebody else, that if they say something that there are going to be consequences for that. And in your experience, what do you know about that fear of reporting?
I know that fear very well. I mean, I still battle it daily when I'm faced with a situation. I mean, it's something that you constantly have to build up your own courage within yourself. But if we don't speak out, and if somebody's going through, let's say I have a friend that's going through a neglectful situation or dating abuse or something like that, and we don't speak out, that person probably doesn't have enough courage to speak out for themselves, and so the problem's going to continue. Okay, they're not going to get help. It could escalate. It could get worse. If you speak out and there's nothing going on and it's maybe a misjudgment, there's no consequences. But there can be consequences if you don't speak out and that person gets hurt or is neglected or something happens to that person. So it's better to over-report than under-report.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So as we mentioned earlier, it's very important that we talk about this information and make sure that you are aware of what different forms of child abuse are, but also very importantly to make sure that you know what to do with that information if you are concerned that you or somebody else might be a victim of either the physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, dating violence, sexual abuse. And we're going to have Rachel in just a moment go over who in the community you can contact if you think that that might be an issue. Who I have with us today are some examples of people that might be right in your vicinity that you can tell if something is going on. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm Mrs. Ulrich. I'm one of the counselors here at McCutcheon. And whether you're at McCutcheon or not, we also have Ms. Deshesky here from Harrison. And even if you're not in one of our buildings, there is a counselor like us in your building that you can definitely tell and should tell if something is going on. Another resource that you have in your building we have our safety resource officers, and you may have an officer walking around in your building that is dressed in uniform, and we often think of them as there to enforce the law for us, but they're also there in very much of a helping capacity. So they're there to help keep people safe, and if you're in an unsafe situation and one of these things applies to you and you see one of these individuals, please say something to them also. So Rachel, at this point, can I have you go ahead and go over who else might be resources in the community that we can reach out to?
Yeah, so you actually mentioned a counselor, even a teacher. I want to hit it very hard that maybe your friends aren't the best person to tell. Your friends are just as inexperienced as you may be. They also may not tell, and they may not know of the resources of the community or who to go to. So I think your best bet, besides a teacher, a counselor, a trusted adult that's going to speak to authorities. Also maybe your principal. These people are actually trained to handle situations like this. Or you have community resources like the YWCA. We actually have a crisis hotline number that's always staffed 24/7. The number is 765-423-1118, so it's a very easy number, and you can always talk to someone there, get advice, maybe get courage to build up to talk to your counselor or to your teacher if you would rather talk to someone you don't know very well first. But any of these people have tremendous knowledge to help you and are so willing to help without any repercussions or consequences. So
thank you very much for your time and attention. Like we said, if any of this information applies to you, please be sure to speak up to somebody. Please tell myself or somebody like Ms. Deshesky at Harrison, or the counselor in your building, or Lieutenant Ricks, or whoever is the officer in your building. So thank you very much.